Hey kids, let's talk about the good old days growing up in Idaho. Hello everyone, welcome to another show of Growing Up in Idaho, talking about the good old days. You know, every kid I know who grows up in Idaho comes face to face with the prospects of hunting at some time or another. And I'm not just talking about deer and elk hunting here. There's duck and pheasant hunting, and some draw out for the cougars and bears. Pretty much any critter that moves and has 4 legs or flies and is edible gets hunted in Idaho during the various seasons. Some people even hunt antelope. When I was a kid, it never occurred to me that a human being would ever want to eat an antelope. In fact, if you ask me, I'd say you could just as well take your buck knife out and saw off a piece of sagebrush and gnaw on that as to eat an antelope steak. Years ago, I was a meat cutter in Wyoming, and I would clear out one of my coolers during game season and cut elk, deer, and moose for all the great hunters in Wyoming. And there are a lot. One time a guy brought a couple of antelope in for me to cut up, and yes, I gave him that look. I silently anguished over the idea of running that trash meat through my saw. He said, "Just make jerky out of these critters, but save the loins. My wife will cook them up for dinner." So here's something that might interest you. As an experiment, I took one of those antelope shank bones home to my black lab, hoping to surprise him with something new. He was a dog that would literally eat anything and be grateful for it. I threw the bone down and he walked over to it, sniffed it over, poked it with his paw, sniffed it again. Then he looked up at me with a questioning look. "Are we so poor that you can't even give me decent dog food anymore? You expect me to eat this?" He put his tail between his legs, walked over to his bed, crawled in, and gave me that look. I actually felt ashamed that I had put him through so much hardship. Well, all that to say, I think eating antelope sucks. But I know there's at least one guy up in Wyoming who feeds it to his kids. And I know one black lab that refuses to even sniff it. So deer hunting was a big deal in salmon. Deer hunting was a big deal in the Hicks family, too. According to my dad, back in his heyday, a proper deer hunt included walking from morning to night, looking for deer to shoot. It was actually a religion, favored by most of the menfolk in salmon, and even many of the women. As Dad's son, I was expected to join in the fray, and I was excited to go camping. I loved being with my dad, especially if we got to go out of the house for a few days and spend some time in the mountains. I loved being in the mountains and taking in the views, but I hated hiking. And I also hated packing a rifle all day. And I really didn't like killing deer. And to top that off, I didn't find eating them all that great either. Now, before I go any further, I must discuss my own disclaimer. I realize that my rant about hunting might disturb some ancient, sacred Hicks family creed. It's possible that some ancestor who's been dead and gone for centuries may hear this podcast, in the afterlife, of course, and come creep into my room and kill me in my sleep because of what I have to say about hunting in this show. So I will take that into consideration. I'll choose my words carefully. If there is, in fact, an afterlife, I want to meet my ancestors on good terms when we all meet up someday. Anyway, back to the story. To put it precisely, my opinion of a good day hunting was driving into the mountains early in the morning, seeing a herd of deer just off the road, shooting one, and then being home before breakfast. A breakfast, ironically, not of venison, but of real meat, like a beef tenderloin, or better yet, bacon. But my opinion probably didn't count in Mike Hicks's book of hunting. And come to think of it, I never brought it up. It was all about Mike Hicks, one of the country's great outdoorsmen and hunters. If I brought up the fact I didn't really like hunting, hiking all day through rugged terrain, packing a rifle that got heavier by the second, I would get left home. And even worse, I wouldn't get to skip school. And I really like spending time with my dad. So I gave in and hunted Dad's way. And this is my story. One season, when I was 15 years old, Dad had the glorious idea to go on the granddaddy hunt of all time. I think it was a spur-of-the-moment idea that had been conceived in his brain for 10 or 20 years. So Mom took Dad and my brother Mike and me to the top of the Williams Creek drainage, clear to the top. We should have had oxygen tanks. For those who don't know the lay of the land around Salmon, Williams Creek is one of the drainages over from our homestead on Prow Creek. It's about 8 or 10 miles southwest of Salmon. As we piled out of the family van and I took a big breath of that fresh mountain air and looked out at the beautiful scenery in front of me, I had the sudden realization that this experience was going to be hell. Hell, I say. It was barely 10 o'clock in the morning, and I knew what I was going to be doing the rest of my day. But I was powerless to voice complaints, for the reasons mentioned. I really was kind of afraid to upset the ancient Hicks family tradition of killing wild animals for food and bragging about all my hunting exploits with anyone who would listen. And I was afraid to bring the wrath of my dad down on me. He was my hero, and I was trying hard to stay in his good graces as his second son. My only choice was to hike and to suffer. I pulled my rifle out of the van and loaded it with Dad's special rounds. A few years before, we all went up to Elmer Keith's place a few miles up the road from us and discussed the hottest rounds possible for our hot sixes. Of course, Elmer sent us away with some good information, all scientific, of course, and we loaded our own rounds to his specifications, and they were hot. We could have hunted elephants with those loads. My rifle was a gift from my Grandma Hicks that I got a few years before that. We bought it from Jed Wilson's AA. It was an Austrian-made Mauser with a decent 3-9 power scope. I knew its value the moment I put it up to my shoulder and sighted down the barrel. I knew Dad knew its value too, and I think he coveted my new gun more than once. I caught him looking over it a few times, running the action and saying over and over, "Jeff, this is a beautiful gun." He had an old Springfield .6 with a typical Springfield action. My new gun was, in fact, light and beautiful, and I was proud of it. I slung it over my shoulder and threw 2 or 3 handfuls of extra shells in my coat pocket. I was ready to go. I looked over and cracked a cheesy grin to my brother. I wondered if he was having the same thoughts as me about this hunting trip. I never asked. We set out with Dad leading the way. I looked back as Mom drove off in the van with this silly grin on her face. I think she knew the 3 men in her life were going to have a hell of a time getting back home before dark, so she and the girls could play and have a party without us hanging around getting in the way. Right then I fantasized about 3 big bucks popping right up in front of us, shooting them, and hailing Mom before she got too far away. But that just wasn't to be. That day, as I trudged through the wilds of central Idaho with a frowny face, one terrible and gloomy thought was, what would happen if we actually shot an animal this far from home? The answer made me shudder. More hell, dragging the deer over rocks, sagebrush, cliffs, mountains, and maybe even through a creek or two. I'm sure my observations of reality never even crossed Dad's mind. He was so excited for this hunt, to walk his legs off and mine and Mike's too. I didn't want to rain on his party. Not only was the walk painful, my beautiful Mauser-action German-made rifle became my enemy as I trooped along through the sagebrush. Its weight pressed into my shoulder and arms, and soon began to press into my indomitable soul as well. After 3 miles, I was no longer a he-man out hunting and gathering as my ancient ancestors did. I was a kid who just wanted to be home watching MASH and eating Lay's classic potato chips. I noticed my brother was wearing his favorite hat. I don't know why I didn't notice it before. It depicted an evil-looking monster on the front, just above the bill. Above the monster were the words, "I hate everybody." That's just how I felt at that moment. I had lost the zeal for this trip way back, about the half-mile mark, 30 minutes after we started hiking. As we began our descent into the Prow Creek drainage, Dad claimed that deer were in the area, and we would be running into them soon. At this point in our journey, I was near exhaustion. Hypothermia and dehydration had overtaken my system over a mile back. However, I found that my bodily condition improved a bit when Dad announced that deer were in the area. I had no idea how he knew, but an influx of adrenaline had saved many a wayfarer's life. After a while, when I realized Dad was full of horse crap about deer being up ahead, I returned to my near-death state and trudged on. I had learned many years before that to complain at a time like this was against the silent code of manhood and would surely mar the Hicks name. So I kept my mouth shut and repeated the S and F words under my breath. I really didn't care at that moment how unholy it was to swear. We passed by some 12-foot bluffs about halfway up the side of the canyon. I remembered a story about my great-uncle, who was out one day and saw a deer walking along a trail just below him. He positioned himself above the deer on a bluff, where the deer would walk under within a few minutes, and he really wanted to kill that deer and have some meat in the freezer. But he didn't have his gun. All he had was a knife. So he did what our ancient ancestors would have done in the same situation. He found a big rock and waited for the right moment when the deer would walk directly beneath him. When he dropped the rock, it fell right onto the deer's head, splitting his horns and knocking the animal unconscious. So Uncle ran down to the deer, pulled out his knife, and made ready to bleed out the animal and get it field dressed. He was proud of his creative abilities in the absence of his rifle. Just as he put his knife to the little buck's throat, the animal woke up and gave him the worst kicking and beating of his life. Uncle was so bruised and cut up from the beating that deer gave him with his sharp little hooves, he barely made it home. Chalk one up for the animal kingdom. So, after an eternity, we finally made it to the bottom of the canyon, and were soon walking along the Prow Creek Road. It would be 2 more miles, and we would be walking in the front door of our house. Dark was coming on, and the weather was cold and breezy. My mood had darkened to the point of blackness. When you're cold, but you stop shivering, and your mind stops working, you know the end is near. I looked over at Mike. He looked like the Walking Dead, like he had just crawled out of a grave, slung a rifle over his shoulder, and stepped in with Dad and I. So what about Dad? He was walking along like nothing was wrong, grinning. How could that be? Was he born on the planet Krypton? Was he just plain crazy? Hell, I know I was in better shape than him, but he looked like he could have run a marathon. Amazing! I think Dad seemed to sense his boy's demise. We weren't laughing at his jokes anymore. I think he was afraid of mutiny by 2 armed and dangerous teenagers. So he began talking and joking to relieve the stress. In the past, during times like this, Dad chose interesting topics to discuss. This time, it was the topic of love. Love? Yep, that was it. It was time for the birds and the bees. But he didn't talk about any lurid details like you might be thinking. He actually just wanted us to know that it's really important to treat women with love and respect. He said he reminded Mom every day that he loved her, but most importantly, he showed her he loved her. After listening to his story for a mile or so, my mood lightened and I forgot that I was pissed off and tired out. And I was intrigued by Dad's depth of knowledge on the subject of love and relationships. On this hunting trip of all places. He should have written his own book. I slogged along with some new thoughts to dwell on. Finally, we made it home. As I dragged my feet through the door and headed down to my room, my mind went over all the activities of the previous 10 hours. The only thing my brain would register at that point is how tired I was. There was also the nagging reminder that we had not seen a single deer that whole time. Not one. In fact, we saw no wildlife whatsoever. Not even a measly little smart-aleck squirrel or a stupid grouse. I kicked off my boots and gingerly laid back on my bed and breathed a sigh of relief. As I lay exhausted on my bed, I couldn't imagine where Dad had gotten the notion that walking all day, carrying a gun, and looking for a deer to shoot was something desirable. In my estimation, there wasn't a deer in the whole damn United States that was worth the trouble. How about we buy some hamburger from Safeways and call it good? Or better yet, let's buy some bacon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Growing Up in Idaho, talking about the good old days. I hope you like it. For those of you who would like to subscribe to this podcast, click on the link posted with this episode. You'll be given some options to subscribe with iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or even Spotify. Pick what works best for you. Also, if you feel inclined to support this podcast, click the appropriate Buzzsprout link. All donations are gladly accepted. It's my goal to never pollute my show with distracting ads. Anyone desiring to join the Facebook group Growing Up in Idaho, just let me know. Anyone's welcome. Thanks for listening. Growing Up in Idaho, the good old days.